Not only are dog noses a great opportunity for you to add color to your pet portraits, but the use of this one very simple watercolor technique will make them look so lifelike. The technique is called lifting, and I'll walk you through how I do it with these examples of Bernie and Sango. And at the end of this video, I have a bonus technique to share with you using Derwent Inktense Pencils. You can find all the supplies and the paint colors I'm using for these portraits in my supply list at paint333.com. I like to choose my colors before I start my portraits, and I knew with Bernie I wanted his nose to be green, which I know is a little different for pet portraiture, and I don't do it very often, but sometimes the pet's expression just calls for green. After we paint Bernie's green nose, we're going to go the other direction and give Sango a pink and purple warm colored nose. First up is Bernie. Usually when I paint areas of high detail, like eyes and noses, I will give it a black outline before I start my three-step process. My three-step process goes paint with water, drop in color, usually dark to light, but that's flexible, and then finish it off with texture techniques. We'll be going through the three-step process for these examples. But first, you can see here that I'm starting with some black outlines. I found that this helps me not lose where the darkest darks need to be. Because oftentimes when you're painting, you can lose your pencil lines when you lay down the color. And the outlines with noses and eyes, those features, those proportions are really important to get right. Hence why I start with those black outlines. I just make them by doing a heavy mix, so a lot of paint, not a lot of water, of my neutral tint black color onto dry paper, usually using my round brush. I'm also dropping in some other dark colors before I incorporate water and then using those texture techniques by giving it some purple and establishing where the whiskers go. When your paint is still wet, it's fun to use a grainer brush to pull it into areas of dry paper to give it a textured look. Often I will do that on the muzzle, the mouth of the dog, because it's usually hairy, so that edge isn't a perfectly straight edge, and it's also not necessarily a softened edge. It's a furry edge. So I will pull that black paint or whatever color paint that is still wet on the edge of that muzzle down into the dry paper so it looks like a furry edge. From there, I add water and color according to what my reference photo looks like. Typically, my colorful areas are next to the darkest darks and are the midtones in the painting, but this is fluid and something you kind of just have to practice where you like the color to be. There is a dark side and a light side to every pet portrait that I like to do, and that also helps me understand where and what color goes where. So I'll have the darker shadow colors on the dark side and the highlight colors on the light side. As I go, you can see I'm using the technique of scraping to again establish more hairy whiskers and fur texture in his muzzle. So for Bernie, his shadow colors are blues and purples, and his highlight color in his nose is green. So I basically am shifting from purple to blue to green to even a little bit of yellow on the very highlight side of his nose. I have a video about the 4 techniques that I typically use in all my portraits, and it goes over scraping, lifting, glazing, and using grain or brush. But this video is all about lifting. So once the nose has the color I want it to have, it still has white space for the highlight side reflections in the nose because noses are shiny, so they still have reflections. I let the nose completely dry. Then I take a round brush. I typically use one of my older brushes that has stiffer bristles for this technique, and it works really well. Basically, you just get the brush wet, dab it on a rag, and then scrub the dry paint off of the paper. This will likely take a couple passes in the same area to get it back to the lightness you desire. I just love using this technique to establish the bumps on the dog's nose. But you don't want to do too much. Again, less is usually more, especially in pet portraiture. So I typically will center the majority of the lifting dots in the center of the nose, and then using it sparingly around the edges of the nostrils. Again, it depends on the reference photo you're using to see what's going to look good for your pet portrait. Let's move on to the portrait of Sango, who again has a nose that's more purple and pink. Before I started painting Sango, I masked out his whiskers. With Bernie, we didn't have to do that because his whiskers were dark, and I just penned in his whiskers at the end with an ink pen. But with Sango, his whiskers are lighter, and so I just masked those out at the beginning using my pointy palette knife and PBO masking fluid. So we're going to make sure that's totally dry before we start painting. I started again by establishing the outlines in his muzzle so I wouldn't lose where everything is when I start to add color and water. Then I'm going in with water and color and adding things where it goes according to the reference photo, establishing the dark side with more purple and the light side with more pink. Using my grainer brush while the paint is wet to pull it around and make sure I have those furry edges. So now you'll see I'm dropping in color on the nose, going from blue, transitioning to purple, and into pink, from his dark side to his light side. We're concentrating the color at the edges of his nose so that we have that nice highlight in the center. And then I'm coming in with a nice orange color to brighten up the highlight side of his nose. Now we've established the bumps on their noses with lifting, but you can also do it with paint and make the bumps darker in the shadow areas of the nose. I'm adding some more fur texture and color to the bottom of his muzzle. Then we're going in with our round brush to lift off those areas that we want to describe as the bumps on his nose. You'll want to dab off the color on a rag between each pass, otherwise you're going to be putting that color back into the area you're trying to lift out. So as you're lifting, you're going to probably have to clean off your brush in the water, dab it almost dry, lift off the color, dab it onto your rag, lift off the color, dab it onto your rag, and repeat that process until you get the lifting you're looking for. Then I just finish out some more detail on his muzzle using my grainer brush. When the whole entire painting is dry and finished, I'll go in and remove my masking and then come in and soften the edges a little bit because masked edges can be a little harsh. So here is a really fun technique you can also use to establish the bumps on their noses. So we talk a lot about highlight colors and shadow colors, and if you want to establish colorful bumps on their noses as a kind of highlight color instead of just lifting off color, you can do that. And one of my favorite ways, you can do that with just paint, but one of my favorite ways to do it is to use a Derwent Inktense Pencils. For this example of Reba, I used their tangerine color, and you just dip it in water. You want the surface either of your art or the pencil itself to be just a little bit wet, not very wet, just a little bit. So you're going to have to practice kind of dipping it in water, dabbing it on your rag, and then painting, coloring in the dots on your painting. Again, less is more when it comes to putting these dots on the nose. If you fill in the entire nose with dots, it's going to not be nearly as interesting. So pick a kind of center of interest to cluster the dots into, and you can even shift from the highlight color to the shadow color within your dots using the Inktense pencils or your paint. Either way, I hope you have a lot of fun painting your dog's nose using these techniques. If you're curious about the brushes that I'm using, both for lifting and for adding detail, and of course the grainer brush that I like to use, you'll want to grab this PDF download at paint333.com. I also talk about the paint that I love to use and why I only have 7 colors. We also masked out our whiskers on Sango, so I'm sharing the masking fluid I love to use and the palette knife that I use to apply it. This is exactly what I use in all my paintings, and I think especially if you're a beginner and you're overwhelmed by the options for supplies available to you, you're going to want to take a look at that, because that's not just a list of what I use, it's why I like to use it and information about what you should look for when you're choosing your own supplies. If this video was helpful for you, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you are working on with watercolor. Happy painting!